And I'm covering a fairly large geographic area on this channel. It originated in the Ohio Valley with the goal of documenting common trees and sometimes not so common trees of that area. And the area to the north of that, the lower Great Lakes, and the Appalachian region to the east of that. Well, I'm spending a lot of time in southern and central New England now. And I've been able to get some new trees and trees that I didn't even intend to get when I started this channel. And I started this channel with the intention of 5 pines, and I got 5 pines within a couple years. Virginia, shortleaf, Table Mountain, pitch, and white pines are all found in that area. But if you go beyond the lower Great Lakes to the central and northern Great Lakes, above the Thumb in Michigan, and across southern Canada to central and northern New England, you find red pine growing in certain habitats. And I have. And I'm a little bit below where the range map shows it growing commonly. I'm right on the Connecticut-Massachusetts border here at a place called Breakneck Pond. Beautiful natural body of water with no houses on it. And spent a whole day back here recording for Let's Dig a Little Deeper a few weeks ago, and that hike is on my other channel called Let's Dig a Little Deeper is the name of the channel, and the hike is labeled Exploring Connecticut's Bigelow Hollow and Breakneck Pond. It's actually got 2 segments. Well, I was out here that day, and the evergreens out here are pristine. There's very little hemlock woolly adelgid damage, at least not large trees that are dead. And in some windier locations where red pine, which is going to be the 6th pine I've added to this channel, can be found in more northern locations, I did find some. There's a little tongue of land sticking out here, about a 1/4 mile to my northeast. I'm at the southwest end of that pond. It runs southwest to northeast. And on this little tongue of land, I found a nice population of red pine. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was more to be found along this pond. I'm going to be hiking around the entire pond this morning. It's about 1.25 miles long, and the trails go in and out from the shoreline. We'll see if we can find some more. Red pine tends to grow where it's real windy and rocky and open, and often gets shaded out and replaced in more mature closed canopy forests. And while recording for Let's Dig a Little Deeper, after that I found more of it growing in southern New Hampshire, and I'm going to stitch this video and that video together so we can get an idea of what red pine looks like, where it grows, and compare it with a few other common pines. Let's continue on. And the trail along the immediate west shore of Breakneck Pond is labeled with blue and red markers, or paints, mostly painted on the trees here. There's also some service roads that run parallel to that trail that are a little easier footing. This is quite rocky in places. As you come along the steeper rocky hillside here, there's a little spit of land out in this pond where I found the red pine. And it's still here. And again, if you get out of its natural range, you often find red pine growing in plantations. Those are often even-aged trees. They tend to go really straight and really tall, and they all look about the same. Often they're planted in rows. And our beaver's been busy back here. And you know, the fact that he's keeping this canopy open might give these red pines a little chance of surviving in a place where there's a lot of competition for sunlight. Got a dead one right here with a bunch of white pines and oaks around it. But there's probably 30 or 40 trees on this 2-acre peninsula of land back here. So let's take a look at them. Didn't completely surprise me to find this back here when I was back here in May. As we look up, we've got a white pine on the right, right there, with a red pine just below it. I'm zooming in on right here. So it's definitely a different look. More coarse. Looks like foxtails or squirrel tails on the end of each branch. And to the left here, there's another red pine. So just by looking up, we can see a huge difference between that and the white pine. And what could be confused with pitch pine, that also is a different appearance as well. And our bark. There's our name, red pine. Boy, oh boy, look how pretty that is. It's fairly smooth to the touch. It flakes off in thin sheets. And these trees are often very, very straight, especially when they're in plantations where they're growing in less windy locations. And that guy's reaching for the sky, and again, is much different texture than the white pine to the left. Much more open crown, a lot more sunlight can get through this tree, and help the seedlings grow where they do fall. I don't see any seedlings here. So this pine stand, you know, hope these trees can live a long time. It probably won't be going anywhere anytime soon. But without reproduction, eventually it would. So, got plenty of pine cones on the ground here. We'll take a look at a couple of those. And enjoy the view of Breakneck Pond, which is one of the most pristine parks or ponds in this part of New England. And just for comparison's sake, we've got our white pine right here with this much more blocky and less smooth bark. Does not usually come off in thin sheets. It's more in chunks. It's a darker color. It's not that obvious red color. And boy, feel that wind. So this is definitely a windy location for this red pine to be growing. A textbook location. And again, here's our red pine in comparison with that white pine. Not always a real red color, but there's red to be seen if you peel off the grayer portions of the bark. Definitely has a red appearance, definitely has a different look than that of white pine, and if you look up, there's no comparing the two either. And the cones are small, about the size of my thumb there, maybe not even quite the size of my thumb. And our white pine cones tend to be a little bit longer, often a lot longer than those of the red pine. So we got white pine on the left. This is a small white pine cone, not that long, maybe 3 inches long. They can get double that length. Here's a fairly small red pine cone, about 1.5 inches long. Well, I found a bunch more of these red pines growing on a ledgy area up on Wantoskakit Mountain, about 80 or 90 miles north of here. We're going to study those. We're going to keep looking for them as I go around this pond. I don't know if I'll find any more or not. And then we're going to go looking in some places where they've been planted, and it's very commonly used in reforestation efforts. Not so much now, but it used to be. So you can often find the plantations of these red pines as you're hiking in areas where it doesn't grow on its own. And unfortunately, it is susceptible to some diseases that have come over from other parts of the world with trees that were brought over for ornamental reasons. So there are places where the red pine is suffering because of that, but here it seems to be doing quite well. Let's enjoy this view, and then we'll head up towards Wantoskakit Mountain. And I picked another very scenic place to continue studying the red pine. We started this lesson at Breakneck Pond, about 80-90 miles southwest or southeast of here, right on the Massachusetts-Connecticut border. And we're about 10 miles north of where Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Vermont meet, just up the mountain from Brattleboro, Vermont, on the New Hampshire side of the Connecticut River. I'm looking right down at Brattleboro. I'm looking at the Harris Hill ski jump. And open, windy places are where we find red pine growing on its own. Now, the plantations can be found just about anywhere, and we'll get to those as this series goes on the red pine, but I'm going to do what comes naturally, and that's its natural habitat. And we'll get to the red pine plantations that are pretty common throughout the area I'm covering by this channel. So we'll get to those as time allows, but let's just take a better look at some red pine growing and reproducing on the top of what's called Woontaskakut Mountain here in southwest New Hampshire. And just below that overlook, scramble down these ledges a little, we do have a forest of bare oak here, which is on this channel, and these are much larger than some of the populations of bare oak I found in other preserves. So these actually do look like small trees here instead of shrubs. And right behind these bare oaks, to the center of the screen at this point, is our red pine, and to the right is a white pine. And I'm hoping to find some pitch pine near the northern end of its range on this mountain to compare with this red pine, which is near the southern end of its range. One way I can tell that this is red pine is the needles are much longer and somewhat shiny. The bark is more of an orangish red color even at the bottom, and the branches look like a squirrel tail, like from a red squirrel or a fox squirrel. And then there's a break in the foliage before the next bunch or squirrel tail. And our white pine can get that appearance as well, but the needles are much they're not as stout, and they're usually not as long. Let's scramble down here and take a better look at these guys. And sure enough, we have some needles in view here. I'm not seeing too many cones in this immediate area, but I'm sure we'll find more as time goes along. But the needles, if there's any doubt of whether it's a red pine or a pitch pine, the needles come in bundles of 2. And they tend to be quite long. As long as my hand there. You can see it comes in 2s instead of 3s like the pitch pine, or in bundles of 5 like the white pine, just to the center of the screen behind this red maple. Another way you can tell red pine needles is they snap easy. I'm going to bend this, and it almost broke off just from the first bend, and if I bend it back again, it did snap off. So they're very brittle. I don't know if there's too many places where shortleaf pine, which can have 2 needles in a bundle, would share the mountain with a red pine. So that is one species you might be able to confuse it with, but I don't think the 2 would grow in nature alongside of each other, but maybe in a planted scenario. But we're going to keep exploring this Woontaskakut Mountain. I'm actually recording for Let's Dig a Little Deeper today, and happened to find this red pine and started recording for barking up the right tree because I had the chance to do so. And there will be a video on Woontaskakut Mountain on Let's Dig a Little Deeper here in late June of 2022. And we're on the side trail off of the top of Woontaskakut Mountain. The Woontaskakut Monadnock Trail continues eastward, and we took a side trail to the south towards what's called Mine Ledge. Well, all kinds of evergreens to study up here. We even got some red spruce growing up here along these quartzite cliffs, and 3 pines in one spot. So let's take a quick look at all 3 we've got here. This series is on red pine. Let's take a quick look at the white pine needles. And they do come in bundles of 5, and they do have a white line down the middle of them if you inspect them closely. And right on cue here, we've got a pitch pine and a red pine growing side by side. So this is how the best way to learn your trees, folks. This is in the shade, but this red pine is a light orangish purple color. And a similarly sized pitch pine has a much thicker, rougher looking bark, and it's a darker color, and it has our needles of 3, but a very similarly sized cone. I could say the cones would be easy to mistake if you were just looking at the cones. But the needles on this red pine, it's got bushy squirrel tail. And this pitch pine has a similar squirrel tail type appearance, but the needles are much shorter and they don't break as easily. Let's grab one right here. I've been around these trees enough, especially the pitch pine, to tell them pretty easily from the red pine, but the needles, if they're within reach or at least within view, are somewhat different. This comes in threes. It's shiny just like that the red pine, but the pitch pine comes in threes. And let's try to snap it. When I try to snap that pitch pine needle, it bends. It doesn't want to snap easily. If I bend it a second time, it still doesn't want to snap. And I think with red pine, it almost always snaps on the second bend, if not the first. So this mine ledge is coming into view. I think we're going to have plenty more red pines to study. And then we'll move on to some plantation red pines, which are probably where you're most likely to find them in some parts of the country. Well, we're certainly in a textbook location to find this red pine on the mine ledge just past the summit of Wantascacut Mountain. And quite a few trees here. As I mentioned earlier, it will grow straight, especially in areas that are less windy, but in a windy location like this, it's hard for any tree to grow straight. But that is one way you can tell a red pine. Normally it's a very straight tree, and I did show that at Breakneck Pond when we started this series. But these are hugging a ledge and they're exposed to severe weather, so they become what they become. But in areas where it's very common, the Lake George area and the foothills and mid-elevations of the Adirondacks, these are common along the ponds, common along some of the ledges. This is the way you find it. We'll take a good look at these cones here. And we've also got some cones of pitch pine just down the trail here that we can study. So, as these cones open up, again, they're no more than 2 inches. And what I'm finding here is a lot like the one I found on the ground, which is still in my pocket here. So, a fairly small cone for some of the pines I put on this channel. Let's go right down the path here and take a look at these pitch pines. So we'll keep that image of that red pine cone in mind as we scramble down here, and we go from quite a few red pines to quite a few pitch pines. Great view along this mine ledge overlook here. Southwest, south, southeast, and east. You can see Mount Monadnock from the very nose here. And that's a place I'm wanting to do a tree study in the future. Might have to wait till weather like this returns in the late summer, early fall, but if I can get the weather in July and August, I'm not against trying it then. Now this is all pitch pine at the nose of the mine ledge here. Not as smooth, not as shiny of a bark. They can get really twisted, they often are. They will grow straight in the right conditions, but they're often in places where they're twisted and covered in cones. And a lot of these pines will hold their cones for generations sometimes before they drop. Shortleaf pine, Virginia pine is known for that. And let's get a close-up of one of these pines and we could do a side-by-side comparison with our red pine. And I do have a pitch pine cone at chest level here that I can record without breaking it off the branch here. And on the right is a pitch pine cone, and on the left is our red pine cone. I'm not seeing too much of a barb on the end of these scales of the cone on the red pine cone, and the pitch pine cone gets a little hook on the end usually. And the barb on the end of this scale of the pitch pine cone is obvious and maybe an 1/8 inch long. And those on the Table Mountain cone that I did a few years ago are huge and look like cat claws. But this red pine cone appears to be pretty tame as far as its claws on the end of the scales. And I would say more triangular at the end. And these pitch pine cones tend to be more round at the end. And on average, shorter needles on these pitch pines. And 3 needles to a bundle. And a bark that is much rougher or scalier looking than that of the red pine. We'll continue this lesson on the red pine at a location where there's some that was planted for reforestation purposes, and that's where you will often find it. And I'm going to finish up this series on the red pine. I'm about 3 or 4 counties south of its natural range and about 2 counties south of where I found it at Breakneck Pond on the Connecticut-Massachusetts border. This morning finds me at Mohegan Park. This is operated by the city of Norwich, Connecticut in New London County. And I believe the red pines I'm finding here are planted. This land went into public ownership almost 100 years ago. I don't know the exact age of these trees, but what I'm finding growing back here are of very similar height and very similar age throughout the park. And many of these older roads and the paved roads that are still being used by automobiles, you do find groves of these. There's probably a dozen groves of these red pines back here that I found so far. So let's take a look at some. Again, I don't believe these are native. I believe these were intentionally planted. At the time this park was formed, red pine was being used in many areas of the country within and beyond its natural range for reforestation or, creating a forest purposes. So, boy, these guys are reaching for the sky. They have overtopped some of the hardwood trees here, or kept ahead of them, of these birches and maples here. And all are about 1 foot in diameter. And if I could count the number of whorls. So again, these trees are self-pruning in most situations. Unless the branches are all getting good sunlight, the lower branches do die off. But if you can find where the branches were with these little stubs, it'll give you an estimation of how old the tree is. I'm not going to try to do that, but I'm guessing probably at least 75 years old. Land was first donated for this park in 1906, and many other donations were put in place after that. So let's assume these are almost 100 years old, between 75 and 100 years old. We've got plenty of our pine cones on the ground to help with identification. And no barbs on the end at all, no little hooks on the end. So that means the pine cone is technically unarmed or unbarbed. And when you don't get a lot of rain in the summer, the pine cones can open wide up like that. And when they get wet, they tend to close up again. Most of these are about 1.5 to 2 inches long, variable size. Our needles are very brittle, even when they're dead. They break extremely easy. So I'm fairly certain this is red pine. And most of the bark is red with some gray patches in places. So reddish gray, depending on the actual segment of bark that we're looking at. Let's pause for a minute and look at some of these groves that we're going to explore in the next hour or two here. Again, here's another one about 1 foot in diameter. Another one about 1 foot in diameter. And they're all reaching up towards the sky. And they all got those bushy tails at the end with not too many needles below the end of the branch in this case. Most of these look like a fox or squirrel tail at the end of the branch and not much below that. And after these were planted, many hardwood species came in and started filling in the empty spaces between the trees. And in none of the locations at Breakneck Pond or on Wataskakit Mountain did I find side-by-side trees that were all about the same age. There might have been one or two that were the same age, and then a few smaller ones, a few larger ones, a few that were straight, a few that weren't straight. So we've got some groves here, again, mostly near the roadsides and picnic areas where they are exactly the same size and very straight. The fact we're out of its natural range, it's growing in a very predictable pattern, and are of the age of from the decades when millions of red pine trees were used in reforestation efforts in this country. Again, I'm fairly certain this is not a native stand, but a planted stand of red pine. And yes, the American beech is coming in underneath. And if these red pines can't make some seedlings soon, they will be displaced in time, especially if some of the diseases that afflict these trees find their way to this park. Most of the ones I'm finding here are pretty healthy. There's a dead one right here with some holes in it. So nothing lives forever, but red pines can live a long time if they're in a good location to do so. Let's take another advantage of this pine stand. We get a real broad view here. We're on an old road that's no longer being used for cars. And evenly aged trees of same height and same diameter. I think I found a few seedlings that were taking root up here where there's enough sun for the pine cones to germinate. Let's go take a look at those. And the trees that we were just looking at were all of similar age and similar diameter. Well, you know what? If we get enough sunny openings like this, where the white pine will easily take root, there may be a chance for these red pines to continue on another couple generations in this park. So here's a seedling. I'm assuming this seeded itself in and it was not planted. Most parks are not planting these trees anymore, and I don't even know if they're available at nurseries anymore. But where they're not affected by disease, they are a nice tree. So here's our two needles in a bundle, and quite brittle. Usually have to bend them twice to get them to break. And yes, I did bend it twice and it did break. I think the needles on older trees that are further up break on the first try, but these are the ones that I can reach are growing aggressively. And that may be the reason why it takes two bends to get them to snap. So, got some red pine seeding in here where there's full sun. And with any luck, we'll get some new populations here. But this is definitely not within its native range. I've done a lot of hiking in this county. I've never seen any growing in a natural habitat, but only in these park settings. Got a few back here that have been shaded out or died from diseases. Let's go take a look at those, because you will often find them evidence of previous pine plantations or pine plantings where they're either all dead or some are dead while you're hiking. And I've got a fairly healthy looking tree reaching for the sky here, probably 70 or 80 feet high. And we'll scramble through these bushes here. And I noticed right behind it there were some skeletons of red pines of similar age that appear to be deceased. So you will often see this reddish colored bark on trees that are long since passed away, but the bark remains and the trees remain for many years afterwards. And here's one right here. Again, it's got a lot of holes in it from insects burrowing into it. And if I look up through these beech trees, which are going to replace it, I don't see any live foliage, but just the branches that are dead. So the Civilian Conservation Corps alone, back in the 1930s, planted millions of these red pine trees throughout a lot of the area I'm covering by this channel. So it's not uncommon to find ones that are either in plantation form, that are still alive, or the remains of trees that have since perished from a variety of causes, old age, being overtopped or shaded out by hardwood species. But here's another one right here. We'll drive around this park. Got a few more stands I'm going to show you, and then we'll put the wraps on this study. And some of the more developed parts of Mohegan Park here, which the park itself is well over 300 acres, do have red pines that are of similar size to the ones we just looked at about a half mile up the trail. These pines may have been planted before this picnic ground was established, and before this walking path was established, based on the fact that the path comes right up to the bottom of the tree. Normally you wouldn't want to plant right next to the bottom of it, or plant right next to a path. So I have a feeling the pines were here first. But again, all about a foot in diameter. They're all reaching for the sky. So here's what our pines look like in a non-native setting. Predictably straight, predictably the same age, and with a few seeding in on their own where the full sun allows the red pine cones to do so. I got a few other projects that I'm working on this summer for the second half of the growing season. Common juniper is on my to-do list. I'm going to do a continued study of the black gum with its foliage and fruits if I can find them, as well as its fall color. So that's on my to-do list for the next 2 months as well. And a few destination hikes. Mount Monadnock is one I've been discussing on this channel for about a year now, and that is on my to-do list as well. We'll see if we get the right kind of weather we need to climb a mountain like that in the next 3 or 4 months before the snow sets in.